Events on the kingdom calendar have often been compared to childbirth. They might start slow and be ambiguous in the beginning, but the closer they come to fulfillment, the more they increase in speed and intensity, and the more clear things become. And I have had 4 children, and each time I hoped that along somewhere in the process things would become clear a little bit sooner than they did. Unfortunately for everybody involved in helping me through that process, it took a while before things became clear as to what was happening. But it was always true. Things were most scary and confusing before I could understand them. And we're in John chapter 19. We're right in the middle of the account of Jesus's crucifixion, and it must have been a confusing and terrifying night. And as John writes about it, we keep bumping into this phrase that he repeats. What is the phrase?
It's that so scripture might be fulfilled. And we read this phrase in John 19, verses 24, 28, 36, and 37. And John might have been confused and terrified as these events unfolded. But now as he looks back and writes about it, he knows why everything happened the way that it did. And he was an eyewitness who could testify that events unfolded exactly as God intended them to.
No, that's so true. One of my favorite scripture pairings comes from the books of Genesis and the book of Galatians. And Galatians 3:8 says, Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham. And one of the passages that this verse is pointing us to is in Genesis 22, where he comes to Abraham and he says that he's coming. It says in Genesis 22:1 that he's coming to test Abraham. So let's look a little bit deeper into this chapter.
So it begins by God asking Abraham to take Isaac to the land of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain that God guides them to. And if we're only looking at this story as a human story, it's confounding, confusing, and potentially misleading. But Abraham is one of God's prophets, and God is using Abraham to preach the gospel in advance. So it's important that we keep that in mind. God tells Abraham to take his only son, the son that he loved.
And if we're familiar with the story of Abraham and Isaac, we know that Isaac isn't Abraham's only son. There's also Ishmael, but Isaac is the son of the promise. He's the son through whom God promised nations would come. And yet we see in Genesis 22:3 that when Abraham was told to go do this by God, he gets up early in the morning and begins his agonizing act of obedience.
Well, and it's so hard to imagine how all of this played out with Sarah and Abraham and Isaac, because, I mean, these are real people with real feelings. And I mean, they walked for 3 days, it says. Abraham and Isaac and these 2 men, their donkey, some wood, and they're walking along. On the 3rd day, Abraham sees the mountain. And so what does he say to the 2 men who have been traveling with them?
He tells them to wait with the donkey while he and Isaac go to worship. Abraham can't have known how all these things were going to turn out, but he knew that whatever he would be asked to do, that his obedience would be an act of worship. And he must have trusted in what he knew to be true about his God, because with no evidence to support his claims, he tells them that he and Isaac are going to worship and that they're coming back.
And Abraham takes the wood for the burnt offering and he places it upon his son's shoulders and they set out. And Isaac can't be quiet because he sees that they have the wood and that they're going to worship, but where's the sacrifice? And so he asks his dad about it, and his dad tells him that God himself will provide the lamb of the sacrifice.
Well, and then Abraham binds his son to the altar. And I mean, I cannot help but wonder if this is why later on in Genesis, God is called the fear of Isaac, because I mean, he had to have had some very real fear at that point. And I can't imagine what both him and Abram were thinking as this played out. But I find it interesting that nowhere in Genesis 22 do we see Isaac fighting Abram. And it seems like, I mean, this could have happened, right? Abram was an old man at this point. Isaac would have been young and strong, but he doesn't. And so, again, makes me think, but when Abram raises the knife it is at that point that God stops him. And it says that God knew that Abram had a right fear of him because he didn't hold back his only son, the son that had been promised from God. And so we see that the knife did not fall on this son of the promise. And so what happened next?
So Abraham looks up and sees a male lamb, a ram, caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham took the ram and offered on the altar instead of his son.
Yeah.
And Abraham named that mountain, "The Lord will provide," or "The Lord will be seen."
Wow, I love that. And switching gears just a tiny bit, but not. When my kids first learned to read, I didn't teach them or help them learn by giving them a book and just saying hop to it, right? They first learn their letters, what sounds the letters make, how they form together into words, words into sentences, sentences into paragraph, and so on. It was a process of beginning with a small seed and watching it grow. And this is how all of us learn. We all grow and develop, starting small and then it grows. And this one principle of interpretation of the scriptures is called the law of first mention. And it simply states that the simple comes before the complex. And so when we're studying important concepts and images in scripture, we find the first time that a word or a phrase or a concept is mentioned, and then we study it, because that's where we'll find the simplest and the clearest presentation of this word, concept, or idea. And so how does all of that relate to this passage?
Well, it's in this chapter in Genesis 22, that we see the first time the words or the phrases only son, love, burnt offering, and worship are used. And the word worship is defined as honoring with extravagant love and extreme submission. So when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his one-of-a-kind son whom he loved, the son of the promise, born to a woman who in physical terms wasn't able to have a child, he obeyed. And more than that, he considered it an act of worship, an act of extravagant love and extreme devotion to God.
And the place where this happened was the place that Abraham named, the place where the Lord will provide, the place where God will be seen. About 1,000 years later, another son of a promise, Solomon, the promised son of King David, built a temple on this mountain. And about 1,000 years after that, the true son of the promise entered the temple and said to the people waiting and watching for their Messiah, that their father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad.
Jesus told the descendants of Abraham that while he was on the mountain where God would be seen, their father saw the true Lamb. Jesus told them that Abraham saw a picture of the good news before the fullness of it came.
And when the gospel was preached in advance to Abraham, he saw the most extravagant act of love and the most extreme display of devotion when the one-of-a-kind son of the promise carried his own cross up another place, knowing that this time there would be no substitutionary lamb offered in his place, because he was the lamb that God had promised, and he was the sacrifice that was going to show God to the world. And so the knife that didn't fall on Isaac, it would pierce Jesus instead. And I mean, I can think of no other way to end this than to say with Paul, oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and inscrutable are his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen.
Amen. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.